This is the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum Oral History Project. I'm interviewing Richard Fox, Dick Fox. My name's Hannah Nordhaus, and it is the 1st of December 2004, and we're at Dick's house in Aurora. So to get started, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about your background, when you were born, where, what your parents did, schooling, that sort of thing.
Born in 1940 in Juanita, Nebraska. That's where I was raised. Then went to college, graduated from Nebraska State College, Chadron, and went into the military in the Air Force for 6 years. I got out, I started to work for the health department, worked for the health department until year 2000 when I retired.
Where were you stationed for the Air Force?
Several places, in Texas, Montana, overseas in Vietnam, and then in Thailand, and then back to the United States in a station in Wisconsin, and that's where I was when I was released from the service.
And what years was this when you were in the Air Force?
From 62 through 67.
And what did you study in school?
My degree is, I had a dual major, chemistry and biological science.
So is that what took you to the health department after?
Yes.
And tell me, if you want to tell me a little bit about the history of your career in the health department.
Started out in the laboratories as a chemist, then moved to the Air Pollution Control Division as an inspector in the enforcement section. Then I took over as section chief for the compliance monitoring and enforcement section. And then when they had the raid at Rocky Flats and the health department got fully involved in that, I moved to the Rocky Flats program and was there until I retired.
Okay, so that was from 1989 to 2000 that you were...
Right.
Okay. So I guess if you could tell me a little bit about maybe the first, when did you first learn about Rocky Flats? What was the first time you ever heard there was a plant out there?
Actually, it was when I was in school. I did a paper on nuclear facilities, and Rocky Flats was one of those that I found in the references that I went through.
Oh, that's interesting. What was the paper about?
It was basically on nuclear reactors and how they operated. But I was looking at all the different nuclear facilities. Rocky Flats was one of them that I looked at, but it didn't get into because they didn't have a reactor at the site.
So when you moved, and you moved to Denver then after the Air Force?
Yes.
And when you moved there, did you hear much about it?
We heard some about it. I heard a little bit more about it when I took over the compliance monitoring and enforcement section, because I was in charge of the contracts with local agencies that did inspections on the different facilities. Of course, Rocky Flats had air pollution sources, so that was part of it, but I didn't really get into it that deeply until I moved to the Rocky Flats team.
And when you said contracts with local agencies, these are local state agencies, federal agencies?
Local health department agencies, counties. It was Jefferson County had the contract to do the inspection there.
And so what was your interactions at that level?
Nothing directly with the plant. It was strictly with the county health department.
And what kind of pollution were they?
Mainly they were from things like the boilers, in the heating plant, the different emergency generators, things like that. The county did not get into all the emission points as thoroughly as they should have at that point. And we were not aware of all those until we started doing on-site inspections.
And so these emission points, these emissions were you looking at traditional pollutants?
Yes.
Not at
That's correct.
radiation?
Mostly from the burning of fossil fuels.
And so Jeffco was negligent, or I don't know if negligence is the right word, but they weren't even in tracking those pollutants? They weren't really?
They did a fairly good job. They didn't have all the points of emission actually inspected and cataloged. That was one of our first jobs, was to find all the emission points. So we had to inspect all the different buildings that were there, all the different facilities that might produce any pollutants.
And these would be, again, you said boilers, incinerators too, or is this?
Boilers, incinerators, the emergency generators, all the points of emission, anything that goes to the atmosphere we had to look at.
And did you have a sense of why Jeffco wasn't able to monitor all those points of emission? Was it they were told of them, or that they just sort of had a friendly relationship with?
It was a combination that they were not aware of all of the points. They did not have anyone that was cleared to do the inspections, say in the buildings, to look at all the like the bag houses and things like that, all the filtration systems. And they looked mainly at the large points, like the steam plant, for example, was something that they looked at because it was very evident there. They didn't have the clearances to get into the buildings to really look through them, and we weren't fully aware of all the things that were there at that time.
When were they first allowed on site at all? I mean, was this an ongoing thing since the plant's inception, that they were monitored by local agencies?
I'm not sure when Jefferson County first started going on site. I know that as part of the contract, like I say, we contracted with all the different county health departments, not all of them, but a number of them. And we had the emission points on various facilities there at that they would be contracted to inspect. They were paid for taking care of those inspections, which was done because the state couldn't have inspectors that's going to be able to look at every point in the state. So where there was an organized county health department that was willing to work a contract, we selected the points that they had to inspect each year, and they would do it from that point. One of the things that we did when we first started out there was going through everything, then having the plant get the permits that were required and fill out the air pollution emission notices that are used to determine the levels of pollutants and types of pollutants that are emitted from any source.
So, I don't recall if you said, when did Jeffco begin regulating Rocky Flats?
I'm not sure. There was an interim contract that was in existence when I first started working with that portion of it. When I took over the compliance monitoring enforcement section, the contracts were one of the things that I did work with, and that's when I really got more familiar with what the counties were doing, other than the counties that I had inspection responsibilities for prior to that.
So I guess maybe now it might be, well, I guess I'm wondering if what changed. Obviously a lot changed with the FBI raid.
Right.
Do you feel that the FBI raid reflected a change in an era where suddenly state agencies were able to have more say on federal facilities, or did the FBI raid actually cause this change?
I think there's two things. It did allow a change in that it made the plant and probably the federal government itself, the DOE, more open to allowing specific inspections that were not conducted before. It also, I think, raised the awareness of those of us at the state as to some of the additional problems that were going on, and we found that there were an extremely large number of sources there that had not been noted before. And that was, we found those by actually going out and doing the inspections. It also opened up a little bit more of, you might say, access. And there were more of us that were able to get to the clearances to go on and go through. And that was one of the things that I did, was visit each of the different buildings on site and go through those, determine what needed to have the air pollution emission notice on it, where permits were required, and how whether they were meeting the requirements for emissions on all the sources that we could find there.
And were you monitoring radioactive? Were you in charge of standards and stuff like that?
When we first started, we did not have any specific monitoring. The radiological division at the State Health Department did have some monitoring, but not a lot. We developed a monitoring system for the air pollution, and we had a number of different monitoring sites around the facility that we did install, looking for things like the different, like emissions of NOx, sulfur oxide emissions, particulates, both high vol and low vol type particulates, and
Volume?
low volume and high volume,
And NOx
to
nitrous
collect
oxide,
particulates. Right, and also we looked at different organic compounds that were being emitted, because they did use a large number of solvents and
Right?
different,
VOCs, volatile.
right, volatile organic compounds.
So the radiological division and Al Heasel continued, they
They
monitored
continued,
the
they,
radioactive
right,
leakage.
they ran more of a low volume systems.
Mhm.
And we ran the high vols as well as low vols. We also looked at the PM10 levels. That's the fine particulates, 10 microns and under. So it's a different size of particles. The larger particles will be stopped in the nasal passages, but the smaller particles can get into the lungs, and so they can cause a different type of health problem through those. And the radiological materials can be attached to either large or small particles. So if you're looking for radiological materials, you can get it that way. We also had meteorological equipment at each of our sites, so that we knew the wind directions, and we could do the calculations as to where the emissions were coming from. And we did have sites around so that we had all different areas covered where it would come off. And our monitoring system has to be off-site, so we were just outside of the plant boundaries.
So you guys weren't in charge of plutonium standards and deciding what?
No,
That was radiological.
that would be radiological.
Okay.
Although we did do a lot of work with people on the site, setting up specific monitoring equipment that was on site. And the radiological division did have their monitors on site. We helped them design a new monitoring locations and systems and set those up. They were on site. Well, we did not actually handle those, but we did help them with some of the analysis on it and with the locations.
Because you guys had more experience with airborne
Right.
pollutants than they did.
Right. Yeah, we used the meteorological information that we were able to collect ourselves, what came from like Jefferson County Health Airport, what we were able to get from the site's meteorological monitoring equipment to determine the locations of the different monitoring sites, both on and off the Rocky Flats plant.
So that helped
So-
you model plumes and
Right.
so on?
Yes, we did modeling, and it was another thing that we did is I would get the information of from the site itself, the emissions that they calculated, the amount of materials that they used, and we'd run models to determine what the impact should be, and then we would compare our model results to the actual monitored results. And there's a formula that's used to determine whether that's within or specifications and what health impacts that would create. And that was one of the things that we did in the Air Division.
So by comparing the modeling results to the actual results, you're fine-tuning your model?
You can fine-tune the model, but it also gives you a comparison as to what the actual impact is through monitoring compared to what the estimated impact would be through modeling. Because what's in real life is not always what you can calculate.
Right.
And it's, in a number of the cases, it was very close. In some cases, it would be sometimes the modeling would be a little bit higher, sometimes the actual monitoring is a little higher.
If there was a big discrepancy, what would you do?
If there's a big discrepancy, then we go back and double check all the figures. And that was one of the things where I did have the clearance to look at all the amounts of materials that were being used. We could do a double check. And then one of the things that we did was we always did inspect their emissions controls to assure that they were operating properly, that they were there and where they needed to be.
Were they generally operating properly?
In most of the cases, yes. Occasionally there would be damage. Usually sometimes it was due to worker frustration. If they felt the airflow wasn't fast enough going through an air box, they might poke a hole in the filter to get better airflow. Well, this can allow emissions to go further.
So that was so they could work faster?
So they could work faster.
Because they need like a negative pressure or something?
Right. It's the air, if you're working in a glove box, the air is always drawn through it. And then it goes through a control system. They wouldn't, there was never major problems with the large filters in the filter banks before the actual emission point. Occasionally there would be some damage to those, and they'd have to be replaced. But we did both the visual inspection of those filters as well as their monitoring equipment. We'd check out the levels that were coming out, make sure that the airflows are properly, the pressure drops across the filter banks, things like that.
So these guys are working in glove boxes, so they're working with hot materials?
Some of it, yes. Some of it might be beryllium,
Okay.
things like that. So.
And they're frustrated, and they're poking the hole in the filter that's closest to them?
I know of one occasion when that did occur.
And then they're just hoping that filters further out will catch whatever.
I'm not sure whether they can even took that into consideration. It was getting their own particular project completed was their main objective.
Did you feel the management was complicit in that at all? Or, I mean,
I don't believe so. There were times that I think that there probably was some things like that. They might have been pushing some of the workers. But there were other times when you might not have a complete easy visual observation. It may be a little cloudy in there. If you get more airflow, then the atmosphere inside the glove box clears better.
Okay. So I want to go back and ask a few other questions. You said the low volume versus high volume, that wasn't the size. Was that the microns, or was that something different?
No, it's when you're running the high vols, you run those for 24 hours continuous. The high volume samplers, like a particulate sampler. It catches on a larger pad. It's an 8 by 11 pad, usually glass fiber. And you collect that for 24 hours. And it draws a larger volume of air through for that short period of time. With the low vol, you can use a smaller pad, and you're pulling the longer volume time that you're pulling air through, but you're not pulling as much air through at any one time. So that they're kind of comparative on the amount of air that is drawn through, but not directly. And it's with the high volume, you're running it for 24 hours, or if it's you want a specific time period, you can run for like 8 hours, or if you want to get real fancy, we had some equipment there that would only run when the wind was blowing to the sampling site. So that if say it was on the north side of the plant and the wind was blowing from the south, then the sampler would be on. But the minute it drops within a certain degree of variation from the sampler's location, coming directly from the plant, then it would shut off till the wind direction came back. So you're only sampling when any of the pollutants coming off the plant is coming directly to the sampler.
And is the low volume more approximate like what someone would be breathing?
It is. The high vol actually is more than what you would breathe in a 24-hour period, but it's not sampled every day. While with the low volume, you're sampling continuously, and some of them they'd run up to a week before they would change the filter.
So what are these sampling? They're like a box with a filter in it? Is that what, with fans?
Yes, it's a vacuum sweeper motor on the bottom that draws air through. It's like a kind of a pyramid shape, and on the top is it's flat, where you have a filter that you can seal in there so that all the air comes through a kind calculated area of the filter, so that you know how much area you have. You determine the weight. All the pads are weighed prior to going out. Then they're weighed when they come back in. They're allowed to set for a period of time so that there's no moisture in it. They're reweighed again, and you can determine from that the amount of particulate that was collected.
And then do you, in addition to weighing up, do you do laboratory testing to see?
There are laboratory tests that were run on some of them. Some of them were run for what we call it'd be like your VOCs, it's your organics, basically. There are also other things you can run for it, like different sulfur compounds, run metals, which we did. Of course, they had beryllium at the site, so that was one of the things that was checked, was the levels of beryllium that were on the pad.
Did you find any?
It is a little bit higher out there, but there is natural beryllium in the area. So it wasn't that much more than the basic background, because of the high barrel content of the soil out in that area.
Did you find that the pollutants that you sampled were they different in any way from your basic industrial site?
The only thing that was different was the radiological implications from just from what they would be putting there. There was, of course, you picked that up also from the fugitive emissions from some of the old sites that were out there. And from there is always going to be some emissions coming out. It's impossible to be 100% collection. You can come very close, and they did. There was very little coming off, but there's also a natural radiological material there. It's not that far from the one mine over the back ridge there that is up, and there's basically radiological material everywhere, and you can pick that up with the dust.
And so you said that you can't 100% stop emissions.
Right.
Even that's not even if forget about the fires and all that 903 pad.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they were operating and had no accidents, there'd still be some emissions.
There is a good possibility that there would be. The only way you can completely stop it is not release anything. Mm-hmm. The cleaning methods that they used were basically state-of-the-art methods, and it is something that they didn't want to lose themselves, because it's expensive to make the materials. Mm-hmm. But the levels that we were seeing off-site were not a major problem at all. There was very little coming off. It was mostly like being in background. It's a little bit higher, but then you would expect that in that area. Mm-hmm. If you compared it to, say, a pad here in Aurora, you wouldn't expect to see as high a radiological level as you would on the west side, just because of the natural activity that's there in the mountains.
Okay, so why don't you tell me your recollection of the FBI raid, how you learned about it?
Basically through the news was how we learned about it, and at that point the health department began to think, well, maybe we need to get a little bit further into this. And like I say, the radiological division always had work out there. There was some more activity within the waste management division, but this is where we really got involved, and water got more involved. In fact, the whole health department did. Mm-hmm. And that's where we were able to get the clearances, go in and really look at things. And that was one of the things that I did enjoy about the job. I learned a lot more about some of the other divisions' work, and got involved in that participation, that got into a little bit more modeling and emergency response work, as well as one of the health department's representatives on the emergency response for Rocky Flats, and would set in on the teams. We each had a position within the emergency response rooms.
So, so when you became involved in monitoring Rocky Flats, were you surprised at all the emission sources that had not been?
Yes. There were a large number that we hadn't known about up to that point in time.
Did you feel that it was negligent on their part, criminal?
Not criminal. I would say there was negligence on the part of the operating company and DOE, and to a certain extent Jefferson County, because we just didn't know about all those points. And I suppose there was probably a little bit of negligence on the State Health Department, because we didn't actually go out there and look that deeply. And we probably should have had a little bit better information from maybe our radiological and waste management people that were going out there. But of course they're not as familiar with our rules and regulations as just like we weren't with theirs.
And again, the health department wasn't looking that deeply just because there just wasn't a flow of information, or didn't know what was
There
going
wasn't a
on.
flow of information, plus we didn't have that many, I didn't have that many inspectors on my staff at the time that could visit every one of the sites completely, and we had a number of major projects that we were working on. And but this way, where we had people that could be specifically assigned to that project, it made it a lot better, and we got a lot better coverage and information in. And I think it also made the people at the plant, both DOE and the operating companies, more aware of what was actually required of them as far as air emissions were concerned.
So what was your impression when you first went on site at Rocky Flats? Was it what you expected?
It was actually larger than what I expected. Of course, the first times that I was out there until I got my clearance, I had more limitations as to where I could go. In fact, even to get into our office there, I had to have Al escort me, because I didn't have the clearance to get into that portion of the plant where they had our office located.
And what was your impression overall of I imagine that in your job you had inspected other industrial facilities.
Oh, yes.
Was it different from those?
It was some of the differences that I recall was, of course, the security was a big difference. There was much more security at Rocky Flats. They had probably a little bit better control equipment than I had anticipated that they might. Initially, I would say they were a little bit more hesitant on providing information, but once you show them that you have your clearances, that everything's there, you explain what the requirements are, they became much more cooperative. In fact, that was one of the things that we worked out, was we designed a review of each building, and they went through, there's some of the material, of course, could not be documented in what goes to the, you might say, the general files of the health department, but each building had a total book of all emissions and activities that were done in that particular building, with the different materials going in, coming out, the amounts of materials they were using, the emissions, types of emissions. Most of those were, because they were information that's on the air pollution emission notice, were a matter of public record. The books were kept at the health department, and they're still there, I assume. At least they were when I left. The classified material was kept in a separate file, and depending upon the classification, like UCNI material we were able to have at the health department. Anything that was classified higher than that did not leave the plant site. When I do my inspections, we always sit down and review the notes and make sure that what I was taking off site did not have any classified material in it.
So you sit down with the classifier?
Yes.
Yeah. What was it like to be get your security clearance? Was that
It was for myself, it was much shorter than for a lot of the people. I was put on the fast track, plus I already had an active top secret clearance, so that helped.
So they just asked you a bunch of questions, asked your relatives, and...
That, and they did some background check as well. I think it took, about 90 days for me to get the clearance, which is faster, I think, than normal.
Once you were cleared, did you feel that that the people you worked with there were very forthcoming always?
There were a few that I felt weren't always, but after you start and develop a working relationship, it became much easier. And it kind of depended upon the individual, but in general, I had a very good working relationship, I felt, with the people at the plant. Most of them were very open.
And those that weren't, was it just because of a culture of secrecy, or was there something that they were trying to...
I would say it was more of the culture of secrecy. It made them very hesitant to provide information. Mm-hmm. And initially they would always want, well, what are you taking off? What are you writing down? And we always made sure that what we had, that we were going to basically take off-site, was nothing that was going to cause any problems.
So it was more that they just were not used to sharing.
Right. And they did not understand the requirements that we had in place. Mm-hmm. And I think that made a great deal of difference.
Federal and state regulations.
Right.
So did you have to educate them about that?
There was a lot of education being done, yes, on both sides, because I did learn quite a bit. I saw some things that I don't think I would have ever seen otherwise.
Like what?
Some of the equipment that they had, and it was interesting and very amazing how fine a work that they can do, just like their milling operations, is just very, very fine work that they're doing, and it computerized, how the computers work, the different access systems that they had there was amazing.
Did you get the sense that this education of people, Rocky Flats people, about these regulations that applied to them, was this sort of a DOE-wide thing that was happening at the same time, do you think, or was it specific to Rocky Flats?
It became wider spread as we worked. I did participate with in some of the meetings that they had back in Washington, D.C. involving problems, and it wasn't just problems at Rocky Flats. Places like Pantex and Savannah River and Washington and different places like that. Techniques of monitoring was one of the things that I really did a lot of work with that. And I think it became more evident nationally that there were some problems and how they had to change their attitude. I don't think that even EPA and DOE talked very well. Mm-hmm. And with things like Rocky Flats happening, and then some of the problems they had at Hanford and Savannah River especially, I think it started to change some of that culture.
Were there some, I'm wondering if there's some I have a recollection that there was some legislative change in the 80s that made where EPA, where federal air pollution applied to these. There were some changes in the Clean Air Act, and that did make more all the facilities subject to requirements that had been kind of sidelined before. Because all the government facilities became not only affected by national regulations, federals, but also by state regulation. And that made a big difference. So did you sense some resentment of?
There was some people, I had the feeling, felt that we were intruding on their space. But by you're educating them and having them educate you, I think they found it a little bit more acceptable. If you just go in and say, well, you've got to do this, that doesn't work. And that was one of the things that I was used to with all the enforcement work that we do. Either one side or the other is not going to be happy. But 9 times out of 10, if you did your job right, both sides are mad at you.
Well, that must must be fun.
It was something that we got used to and did. That's why, even though it was a little bit frustrating, dealing with, you might say, both sides at Rocky Flats, it was something that we'd been doing for a long time, so it wasn't a real big problem.
In other facilities where it wasn't
Right.
so emotional?
Well, there was a lot of other places that were emotional too. Louisiana Pacific was a good example of where there was a great deal of emotion involved in some emission problems over on the western slope. And I've been involved in things like that. And it happens at various locations.
And when you say both sides, obviously one side's the industry being regulated. Is the other side the regulators, or is it the public?
The public and the people that are being regulated, and the public that feels that they're being infringed upon. So we're used to both of those coming and screaming at us, and while you don't enjoy it, it's something that you kind of build up a thick skin for.
Did you, in regards to Rocky Flats, was there more public, was the level of emotion the same as, say, at Louisiana Pacific, or was there an irrational fear of radiation on top of that? Or rational?
I would say that there was probably a larger number of people that had an involvement with Rocky Flats, because it could affect a larger area. Like the Louisiana Pacific was very localized in its effect, although there were some extremely emotional people there as well. And at Rocky Flats, there were some that I felt had very good ideas, and some that were a little bit on the fringe side.
Did you feel that do you need to get that, or
If you don't mind,
We're back on. I was wondering, do you feel that the public's response to the prospect of radiation was different from their response to other pollutants?
Yes. There were some individuals that were worried about the broad spectrum of pollutants, but the major emphasis was on the radiological emissions.
From your perspective, should they have been more concerned about the other pollutants?
I think that there should have been a better balance in a lot of cases, but not all cases. The worst emissions that could have been escaped from the plant would have been the radiological. They would have had the greatest effect. Because, but still, I think that some of the other emissions could have taken a bigger role. They could have looked at those a little bit harder.
Or perhaps did have a bigger effect, right? Asthma or
right.
public health consequences.
There could have been if they'd hadn't had as good a controls as they did. There could have been a much broader effect. But again, one of the effects that we saw would be from just fugitive emissions themselves, but that is a problem throughout the state because we're in an arid area, and so there's a lot more particulate in the air.
When you say fugitive emissions, that's just
like dust blowing off, especially if you're like in an area where they're doing earth moving, construction. You see a lot of dirt blowing off, fields out in the farms when they're tilling. If it's extremely dry, you're going to see a lot more particulate blowing off when they're constructing roads, whatever.
So fugitive emissions are emissions that have particulate?
Yeah, they're basically wind-blown particulates. And the particulate can, of course, have any other type of pollutant conglomerated onto it, adhered onto the surface or absorbed.
So what you're in terms of Rocky Flats, there were many more sources than the health department was aware of,
right.
But they were all very well controlled.
Most of them were well controlled, yes. Some of them we required them to put additional controls on, like the service stations for gasoline. They had to put on the vapor controls that they didn't have before. Some of the control equipment had to be tweaked a little bit. They added some afterburners into some of the incinerators, things like that, and they improved their own monitoring systems as well through some of the negotiations that we had with them.
So, what did you find out about this incinerator that was the cause of the initial raid? The alleged cause.
Actually, it appears that some of the information they had was not totally correct, and some of the so-called infrared pictures were actually pictures of the infrared emissions were actually created by heating of the whole facility itself. But it was probably a good thing in that we were able to get more involved, and I think overall in all different phases, the waste management, the water, as well as rad and air, we're able to get involved because of that, and I think improve the level of operation and control of any emissions coming from the site in all the different media.
But that actual incinerator had not been burned?
It had been burned, was my understanding, but it wasn't at the levels that were initially anticipated.
And not secretly at midnight?
And not that I was aware of.
Did you go inspect that incinerator?
Yes, I did. Eventually. It wasn't at the immediate time, but...
It wasn't at the raid?
Right.
Part of your larger...
A larger overall inspection and determination as to what information we needed and what they had to provide and what controls were required.
So, sounds like you got to see all the buildings.
Yes.
I wonder if you could maybe, obviously there are so many, you can't describe them all, but sort of describe the general atmosphere in them, if there are particular ones that stood out as being very DOE or Cold War.
Actually, I wouldn't say that anything really stuck out to me other than, of course, one of the concerns that I think everyone had was, are they following proper procedures? And that was one of the things that we had to get educated on, is what procedures do they have? Like what safety equipment is available, what are they required to wear, and you can just, by walking around the building, are they wearing the proper clothing, are they using the proper respiratory equipment, things like that you would notice you went through. That was basically health and safety concern. And in most cases, I would say that they all followed it quite well. I'm sure that there's probably always occasions that somebody's going to try to slide by, but in most instances, they were very, at least where I was, they were always very aware as to, are you checking yourself out on the proper equipment to see if you've picked up any contamination when you were in one of the rooms or things like that. And they always seemed to be very, very conscious. And the equipment was always available. And that was one of the things that I think probably stuck in my mind more than anything else. And when you go from different things, like whether you were in a radiological area, or like when you go into the buildings where they had beryllium work, again, there was specific things that you had to know and specific approvals that you had to have, health checks. You had to have your respirator fit done and approved.
So was the entire architecture or design or decor of these buildings that reflect what they did?
Not specifically. The cleaning work that was done for any spills or things like that would differ. But the overall architecture was probably what you'd call general facility. And the buildings were designed differently according to what the use was. Like the ones where they did the uranium work had a little different design than where they do the plutonium or where they do the beryllium.
Can you describe
like
what the difference was?
Just in the areas where they handled plutonium, everything was always in glove boxes or transferred in enclosed chain grades, however, different filtering boxes, things like that. It was basically, there was no type of exposure. They were always enclosed. That was not always true with things like beryllium and uranium. But the beryllium, where there was any grinding work or where any loose materials, fine materials could come out, was always done within a glove box type system. So just let it ring.
And were were all the buildings, like in the plutonium buildings, were they wide open rooms, or were they more enclosed than other buildings?
It varied. There were small rooms, and there were very large rooms. Again, it depended upon what the activity was in there, whether it was a molding, whether it was a melting furnace, whether it was forming. There was variations in the size of the rooms. It wasn't like, excuse me, the whole building was just a big open area. No, it would divide it up.
Lots of hallways and that kind of thing.
Right, and the hallways were usually wide enough that you could walk through. Some of them were more narrow than others,
Oh,
but
really?
but
Were there
they were-
exposed pipes and stuff everywhere? Or?
no, only in certain areas. But it's just like any industrial facility. There are going to be areas where it's more open, and then other areas where it is not.
So in terms of feel, was it comparable with an industrial facility, or was it sort of a combination between
It
an industrial
was-
facility and a federal your office building or something?
It was a combination, because there would be certain areas within a building that would be office area. So you get that particular, you might say, open, how would I say, unprotected. You might, I mean, you didn't have to have filtrations, and you didn't have to wear respirators or specific equipment. Then there was other areas that you would just wear your clothing, that you could leave there to walk through. And then you had, of course, the areas where you had to fully suit up and wear respirators and things like that going in. So each building could be have a number of gradations as to what it was like. And then there's some buildings that were just strictly office buildings, or like the heating plant. You got office there, but you also have the boilers.
Were they pleasant places to hang out, or were you happy to leave at the end of the day? At the end of your visit?
It wasn't that much different for me, other than you just had to keep the safety factors in mind when you went in certain areas. But it wasn't that much different than dealing with any other industrial facility.
Were you supervised in the hot areas?
Yes, we always had somebody with us. And when I went on my inspections, I always requested that, or made the offer with somebody from the DOE and somebody from the operating company. I always recommended that they come with me, so that if we saw any problems, we can get it worked out, or if there's any questions from either side, it would be taken care of. Whenever we went in the hot areas, somebody from that particular building was always with us. That way you don't get lost.
Right.
It would be easy to get lost in some of those buildings.
I imagine, sounds like it.
Right.
Did you ever get lost?
There were times I wasn't sure just where we were going, and I was very pleased that we had a guide with us.
So it's sort of a warren of hallways.
It can be, yes. Especially where we got into looking at duct work and things like that, where we're going into areas that the people that work in the building probably didn't even know were there.
I imagine there weren't many people who probably could find their way through all this.
There probably were maybe like 2 or 3 in a building that would really know the whole building itself.
Did they tend to be at maintenance or?
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. So a couple of questions. I guess first, were you ever concerned about your personal safety?
No, as long as the equipment that I needed was available to me, I wasn't.
And my other question, when you said you went in with the DOE representative in a Rockwell, or was it EG&G?
Well,
Or Kaiser, depending on it, right?
Right, depending upon the time, and
Yeah.
O'Dowell at one time.
Yeah.
So-
Did you find that the contractor people were easier to work with than the DOE people, or vice versa?
Probably, I think for the most part they were the same. There were a couple of DOE people that were a little bit more difficult to deal with. They didn't, and DOE was not always with us. Usually one of the operating company's representatives was with us. There were sometimes we did inspections on things and they just said, don't worry about it. We don't have a problem with your being alone. But we always liked to have them with us so that they knew what we were doing. And it's just like when we go to an inspection on any facility in the state, we always wanted somebody from that company to be with us. And one of the things we always said we had to do was meet with the building manager when we first entered the building to let them know what we were going to do and what information we were going to be requiring. Because there were some things that they would have to pull the information together for us. And then that got to be a little bit more routine. The operating company representatives knew what we were going to be needing, and they would contact the buildings ahead of time and say, hey, here's the information that you need to show them, like fuel usage or throughput, amounts of solvents used, whatever. So that information was available when we first walked in. We could compare that to what had been used before, and it made the inspections go smoother and faster so that they knew what we were looking for and we knew what we were going to get from them. And it was, like I say, that education on both sides made it for a lot smoother working relationship.
Were your inspections scheduled?
Not always. If we were going into an area where we needed a lot of information, we would usually let them know. And we had some of them that were what we would call really routine, like looking at, say, the steam plant, where what we're looking at is the amount of fuel burned and things like that. It's something that is on their records. We see the fuel that comes in. The company that furnishes the fuel has to furnish like a sulfur analysis so that we know what kind of sulfur emissions come out from the number 2. They did at one time have the heavy ends of the distillate that they used in the furnaces, so that was a problem, and they dropped those tanks. They went strictly to number 2 and to gas. So that cleans up the emissions quite a bit.
That's VOCs.
Right. And your sulfur emissions especially. So places like that, it wouldn't matter if they knew we were coming.
Because they can't.
They can't fake it.
Right.
And if you're in a production mode, it's kind of hard to fake a lot of things anyway. So
How
that was.
could you, either at Rocky Flats or at the facility, did you ever encounter someone trying to fake something, or you're trying to?
It happens occasionally. They'll try to maybe not give you all the information that you really need. Or if they know you're coming and say they have a bag house that they've been bypassing, then they'll all of a sudden go through. Or we used to have problems with some of the alfalfa dehydration plants, that they would operate at higher temperatures so they could have a faster throughput. But it did tend to burn some of the ends, and so you get smoke coming out of the stack. And if they knew you were coming, they would cut back on the temperatures and cut back on the throughput levels so that they were well within requirements.
So you
So-
figured out that they were doing that by
Oh yes,
doing some
you
practices?
could see the plume, and then by the time, like if you went to if it was a company that had several different facilities in the area, and you knew that one was kicking out, when you stopped, it may be at that say at the regional headquarters, it may be they were having a problem. You take your readings and find the violation. But by the time you get to the next plant down the road, they've already called them and told them you're coming. So they've adjusted so that they're in compliance. But that's more of a problem when you're looking at opacity. And opacity is relatively no problem with boilers when you're burning gas, only if you're burning diesel fuel. But then if they're operated properly, there's no problem, and
Opacity is like more.
that's the amount of light that's blocked by right. It's like the smoke coming out or whatever. And we did also require a lot of stack testing done out there.
But did you feel in your inspection surprised or otherwise that at Rocky Flats they were being straight with you?
I didn't feel that there was any real problems. There's always hesitation the first time or two that you go to a place. Oh, now what are they trying to do? Especially after the raid occurred. The initial inspections, there was a lot of feeling that the people were looking at you like, how are you going to try to hang me? And when you tell them what you needed and explain how it was done and show them and take the time to deal with them, it made it a little bit easier. But it was one of those things. It was kind of like a growth program.
And did you find that one or other of the contractors was easier to work with or more difficult to work with?
The main contracting companies didn't really affect me as much because it was kind of a flow of the people that I worked with would go from one company to the next. Of course, there was always changes. One would move to a different position or leave or whatever. But it wasn't as bad dealing with them, the people that I normally worked with. It would be, I think more of the problem came from the management, the top management level. They were a little bit more hesitant when you go from one company to another. I would say that EG&G were probably the easiest upper management people to work with.
That's interesting because all the people who work at Rocky Flats, I don't think I've talked to anybody who liked EG&G.
Is that right?
Yeah, so I think they were difficult to work for. But
that could be. I don't know about from that point, but from what I had to deal with the upper management, I was able to work with EG&G fairly well. Some of the Kaiser people were very good. Rockwell was a little bit more standoffish. Dow was, you don't belong here.
Interesting.
So, but like I say, the general staff, I didn't have any problems with through any of the companies. It was the upper management that could make you a little disgusted at times.
Just by
and DOE.
By making it difficult for you to.
And some of DOE was bad.
And again, it's just making your job harder to do, or.
That and making the progress in doing it a little bit slower.
Let me stop the tape.
Okay.
Cold War Museum Oral History Project. This is Dick Fox. This is our second tape. I'm Hannah Nordhaus. It's the 1st of December 2004, and we're still at Dick's house in Aurora. So we were just finishing up talking about relations with the contractors, and I think we're done with that.
Okay.
Let's see if there's something else you have to say.
No.
I guess I'm wondering maybe if you could tell me, did you feel differently in your official role working with Rocky Flats than your personal feelings about the plant in any way?
No, I don't believe there was really that much of a difference.
Did your personal, I guess, what did you think about the fact that there was a nuclear weapons plant in your area, nuclear hits, a plant that made parts of nuclear weapons, and I'm wondering if that, your thoughts about Rocky Flats may have changed as you got to know the place better?
No, I don't think it really changed much. It was pretty much the same. It's something you don't necessarily want in your neighborhood, but at the time it was created, it was a necessity. And as long as it's operated properly, controlled properly, It's not any worse than, say, having a microchip manufacturer near. In fact, they actually are a dirtier industry because they don't control their emissions. You don't see the emissions coming out. They're all VOCs, and they can actually cause more health problems than a place like Rocky Flats at times.
What do VOCs, what are the problems?
Respiratory problems. They can also cause problems with different organs. They are carcinogenic as well.
Did you have any frustrations with the legal limitations of your work?
There's always those frustrations because if you find a problem, you have to go through a set pattern. Occasionally there are times if it's really severe, you can go for a cease and desist, go through the courts immediately, but it's still, it kind of drags out. It gets to be a long process at times, but it's something that you get used to. The legal system is the same no matter what you're doing, and it can drag things out.
So in what way might that have played out at Rocky Flats?
We might have known more about the plant earlier had everybody taken more of a proactive stance in getting the information, getting permits, getting the air pollution emission notices, and it would have probably worked the same for all the different media, the water as well as the air, the rad, the waste, that maybe had it been a little bit more, you might say, online from the beginning, it might not have caused all the public furor that it did.
That just wasn't the way it worked then.
No, that was not the way the government worked.
Yeah. And I imagine if you were in this transition, if you were part of this sort of transition to government being more open for a time at least, did you witness the growing pains?
Oh yes. There's always growing pains anytime you deal with something like that, because you have two, you might say, almost oppositely opposed people. That you've got the public that wants to know all this information, the government saying, well, we can't give you all this information, but we're clean. Take our word for it. It's hard for the public to take the word for it. And that was one of the reasons that we went into the excessive monitoring that we did, and requiring the site itself to do additional monitoring, especially when in the cleanup phase. The type of equipment that was used for demolition, putting up the tents when they cleaned up the pads, the monitoring that was required during all those demolition activities, or any earth-moving activity, the follow-up and all that. That was one of the reasons we did it, was to help the public feel better about what was going on, know what was actually coming off.
So it was less to protect them physically than to protect them emotionally?
It was a combination, because yes, there was contamination there, especially in some of the pads, and in the buildings when they pretty well had cleaned the buildings up before they demolished, but there's still always that possibility. So yes, there is a possible physical problem there. So you want to know and control it properly, monitor it properly. But it probably is a psychological thing as well. Maybe that's even more so than the physical.
Is that true elsewhere in your job, or was
Oh,
it
yes.
particularly true of Rocky Flats?
Probably more so with Rocky Flats, just because of the radioactivity that was there. And the way they handled it before, where if it's inside that plant, you don't know anything about it, you can't know anything about it. And I think that that old mindset was probably one of the problems. Even if to me, if they had at least let them know, this is how we work, this is how we control them, this is what we're doing to monitor what is being emitted, and how we're preventing emissions. If that had been done earlier on, I don't think there would have been a problem. as much of a problem. There's always going to be, because when you hear radioactivity, it's been put in such a bad position that I think it just comes to everyone's mind.
Is it in such a bad position, you said?
That it is such a bad thing. And it is a health hazard if it's not done properly. And I think if they would let people know exactly how they were operating, as far as controlling and stuff like that, they didn't need to let them know the really classified, like how much material, what the material is, all that. Probably just by word of mouth, people got a lot of that information. Just by knowing how some of those facilities operate, but and that also made it, you might say, a broader problem than if they would have been a little bit more upfront earlier on.
Did you find in regulating the plant, you had said that the public has this fear of the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
Was it hard for you, once you got to know these people, to crack the whip on them, or to?
No, I don't think so, because they knew where we were coming from. That this is the information that we have to have. This is the standards that you have to meet. And in fact, I think the companies themselves probably really learned a lot, because when they, like I say, we had a book for each of the different buildings, and it basically gave what had been done there, and how it had been operated, what the controls were, things like that. I think the company themselves, the people there, learned a lot about the plant they didn't know in doing those.
How did local, state, or national politics affect your work there?
Sometimes it was a frustration because we're getting conflicting. I would say the local politicians were probably more on the activist side, because that's who they had to deal with. We had our regulations, and that's what we could fall back on. Is this is what we have to do, this is what we're going to do. And if we could see anything that could maybe make an improvement, sure, we're going to tell them. Initially with DOE, they did like to drag their feet, as did the company, but they basically learned that they're subject to the requirements, and they will fulfill the requirements. So that it was, like I say, at times there was a little bit of frustration getting them to get things done, but overall it wasn't any worse than what we were used to.
On the activist side, was there a lot of pressure to do more than what you could do?
Yes, there were some that felt that it should be background 0. Well, the natural background in that area is not 0, and they would not accept the fact that natural background there is higher comparatively, because of the whole area there. You've got natural uranium in the area, you've got natural beryllium, things like that are there. Background is not 0. And there were a number of those people that felt it had to be cleaned up to 0. Well, you can't do that.
If you had to say who was easier to deal with, the people at the plant or DOE, or the people, the protesters and activists, what was there?
Okay. I wouldn't say that one side was easier to deal with than another. There were a number of people that at the plant, especially the ones that I really developed a relationship with, that were very easy to deal with. It was like I call them up and say, hey, this needs to be done, or that. Okay, no problem. They would get it done. There are a number of people on the activist side where, you show them the data, explain to them how you did. Okay, great. You're watching. You're doing what we want you to. But then there are those that it didn't make any difference what you did. They were not going to accept it.
Okay.
So, and we were used to that.
So did you have to go to a lot of public meetings?
Yes.
What were those like?
Some of them I thought went very well. Some of them were very contentious. It depended upon the people that were there, and what their emotional level was at the point.
When they were contentious, how would it unfold?
It was, some of them were almost screaming matches. And to me, it doesn't help either side if you're going to do that. You work to a point where it may not satisfy either side, but if it's protecting health and welfare, and it's allowing a company to operate and make their product, make their profit, that's where we needed to get to. Of course, this isn't for profit, but it was something that was needed at the time it was put in. It probably should have been, maybe the cleanup should have started a lot earlier, but then they didn't know that the Cold War was going to end the way it did. And I think we probably have a lot more weapons than we need anyway.
Did you ever encounter any criticism or harassment because of your role?
Oh, always. We get it from both sides. That's just that was a natural part of the job, because the plant would say, oh, we've got to put all that in, especially the monitoring. It got to be a little expensive. And that was one of the areas that initially some of the upper management people did not want to go for, neither did DOE. But that, we felt, is probably the most important thing we did, was force additional monitoring, and have monitoring that we could show. Sure, you got your models, but your models aren't always right. And we used our own weather data as well when we did our modeling. And we provided that data to the plant that they could add to theirs. We also got the plant's monitoring data as the MET data as well as the other. And to me, it would be more reassuring to see actual monitoring levels than it is to see something that was modeled.
So in the end, they came around. They had to.
Yes, basically they came around. They probably could see the handwriting coming on the wall, but and they could see the advantages to it. And in some of the, as they go to the next project in cleanup, sometimes they would come in with more than we'd anticipated would be their first offer as to what they were going to do with modeling, or monitoring. So that was a pleasant surprise, and I think they saw the value in it. I think it did cut down on some of the rhetoric from some of the activists. Because if you've got a real number, this is what came off. It makes you feel a little bit better than, well, I calculated that you might have been exposed to. A real number is much more comforting than an estimation.
And that must, I guess they weren't accustomed to having to consider public opinion in these
That's
things.
true.
So was your role sort of bringing public opinion to the plan in some ways?
I believe it did. I think what we tried to do, or what I tried to do anyway, was to let each side know what the problems the other side was having, and what we were willing to do. This is what our goal to work for. And I think that made a big difference.
And on the activist side, was there anybody who sort of went over the line in terms of their attacks on you or the department?
There were some that, I wouldn't say personally. I think we were able to finally work things out. Initially, there was a few that had some nasty comments, and you sit down and talk with them if you could get them to calm down long enough. But there were some very nasty comments made about some of the other areas, especially the waste management group. There were some people that were very adamantly opposed to what the waste management people were doing.
In terms of shipping waste and
Shipping waste, packaging, some of the things that they were letting go to landfill and where they were letting them fill. I know probably one of the biggest hassles we had was when they were doing the demolition. They had to get a demolition permit from us. And the controls we put on it were fine, but they felt that we shouldn't have any material that was taken off site that had any activity associated with it at all. And that's almost impossible to do.
radioactive.
Right. There's always going to be a little count. And it was at or below background, a lot of the materials, but if it had anything, it could come off site. Well, but they want the site cleaned up to zero.
Right.
So it's an impossibility to do that.
How do you feel about the cleanup? Do you think it can be done satisfactorily?
Yes. If it's, like I say, proper monitoring, proper operation, proper controls, I have no doubt that it can be cleaned up properly. It's just, it does take money, and it takes time. And I hate to see them get in a big hurry to do it. Because you can set it, not necessarily that. Initially they were trying to. And especially when they wanted to demolish some of those buildings, and we required that it be cleaned inside to a certain level prior to. And they didn't like that, but if they had torn those down initially without a lot of cleanup on the inside, I would have had a real problem with it. And initially they wanted to do implosion, which we said, no way at all. Where they would have explode and fall into itself, which is a good method of knocking down a building, but it's almost impossible to control the fugitive emissions that come off of it. I don't know whether you saw the building, the hotel in downtown Denver, they imploded in the big cloud. Well, they had fire hoses running on that the whole time, but you saw the cloud of dust that came off. Well, if you've got a contaminated cloud coming off, I would have a real problem with it. That's why we said no implosion, period, even after the inside is cleaned.
So instead they had to do it with
There's-
balls,
Right.
which is more labor intensive.
It's a little bit more labor intensive, but the control is easier.
And it's slower.
Yes.
A lot slower.
It is a lot slower.
How did you feel about the decision to close Rocky Flats?
It didn't surprise me. It was time. It had reached its point of no return, you might say, because they didn't need additional triggers. They didn't need the product. The plant was getting in a position where it would almost had to been reconstructed.
Because it's so old.
Because and they're looking at different techniques, different materials. They already had that going at other places, and you can get it out of your backyard.
Which is a good thing, I would assume. From a monitoring perspective.
From a monitoring,
work,
right?
Somewhere down the line there'll be less work.
Yes.
Did your work on the Rocky Flats issue change you in any way?
I don't believe so.
In the aftermath of the Cold War, I'm wondering what you think about the work that Rocky Flats did.
I think it was necessary. It's not a good thing, but it was something that had to be done.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the best things about being involved at Rocky Flats and the worst things and the most interesting things.
Well, probably the best thing was it was an additional education in an area that I wouldn't have worked before. Got in more deeply into other areas like water and waste management, radiation, and emergency response, I met a lot of good people and developed friendships on both the people that I worked with at the plant and what do you want to call them, activists or the public. There was one gentleman that I'd had a working relationship with before and then hadn't seen for quite a while. It was came back and was doing work on the outside. It was on one of the committees there, and we were new to our friendship there. So it was, I'd say the best part was the people and the education. The worst part was probably some of the frustrations that you always get, where you can't get two sides to at least come to a fairly decent compromise. There's always going to be some people that will not accept it on both sides. And that frustration was probably the worst part of it.
Okay. Anything else that we missed?
No, I don't think so.
One thing that just came to mind was you've talked about the emergency preparedness, emergency response
Right.
stuff. You want to tell me about that a little bit?
Okay, they have a special setup, or they had a special setup there that anytime anything went wrong, like, well, just one example is that when they were delivering fuel to the plant, the semi that was coming in, the tanker truck, the one time was at near Christmas, and the owner of the company had let his drivers go on, and he had forgotten that this had to be delivered, so he drove the truck himself. Well, he slid off the road. Well, there was no spill or anything, but there was that potential of a diesel spill. They activate the emergency response center there at the plant, and all the different phases of the plant are represented there. And I was one of there was about 4 of us that participated. There's two sections. There's one where you might say the management area, and the other area is the technical people. And we had a person in each of the separate rooms, and you go in and what's the problem? How can you correct it? What can you do? If there's like a leak in a building during a heavy rainstorm that occurred, they'll activate for that. I assume that when they had the fires, they activated. But anything like that occurs, if there's a control system that goes down, or a fire, or anything, they can activate it. And they have an excellent modeling system that was developed there for tracking emissions. In fact, when we had the forest fires, we called them and asked them to do some specific modeling for us on where the plume would go because of health concerns of the particulate that comes off a forest fire. And they did that modeling for us. So that was part of the relationship that we developed, that they would be willing to go ahead and run those models and do that.
And so your role in these, well, there were exercises, and it sounds like there were a few times.
There were a number of exercises, yes, that we participated in, and they'd have a situation that anywhere from a terrorist attack where they blow up one of the buildings to just a gas leak or something at various things. And I participated part of the time. I was in the technical room, and part of the time I was in the management room.
And the technical room was what?
Okay, that's where they get all the data. It goes to the management people to decide, is this, the technical people will make recommendations as to what action to be taken to correct the problem. And then management says yay or nay.
And so you were representative then of the state and specifically dealing with emissions issues, or was it a broader role?
It was a broader role, because when you're in those two positions, you're representing the state health department in all phases, all media.
Okay. That was interesting.
It was.
And how many times were you activated in a real situation?
In real situation? Ooh. I think I can remember of 5 different times. Like I say, the one was when the tanker truck slid off the road.
Did he survive?
Oh yeah, there was no damage or anything, but they had to bring out another tank to offload because they didn't want to try to pull it back up on the road.
Where was it?
It was, you know where the, well, you know the 904 pad?
Yeah. Oh, it was on site.
It was on site.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was on site.
Oh, okay.
And they didn't want to take any chances. So there was a couple times when it leaked. There was some leaks, water leaks came in. It affected more of a computer area than anything. Nothing really serious. The bad snowstorm, I happened to be on site when it occurred, so they were starting to do their phase of letting people go. In fact, there was 2 water leak questions. There was one when they thought they had a break in a waste line, and it wasn't. It was just somebody had dumped a bucket of water in the wrong place. So things like that occur, and they will sometimes overreact, which is probably good. And there was a spill with inside a berm that they activated for.
So, have you been involved? This sounds like the bad snowstorm was the 2003 blizzard? Or?
I believe it was, yes.
Yeah, so you've been involved.
Oh no, it was before that.
A different bad snowstorm.
Yeah, out there, anytime that there was a good snow and there was usually a good wind, 93 created a lot of problems. There was a lot of accidents. That's why they went to what they called their snow plan and phased the release of everyone that was there and activated the emergency center for accidents.
So you have been involved with? Have you been involved with Rocky Flats since you retired?
No, other than questions that come up occasionally. But as far as I haven't been back to the plant since I turned in my badge.
Okay. Well, I think that's it.
Okay.
So we're recording again. So you were saying the thing that most displeased you.
Probably the thing that I was most unhappy with and displeased with was the front line. When they came to do an interview, there were 3 of us that they interviewed. We went through a long session, and at one point the individual that was doing the interview did stop the tape. He was getting mad, very frustrated with our answers because we weren't telling him what he wanted to hear. And then when we saw it, actually, when it came on TV, they cut out most of the things, and they nitpicked and picked pieces that they spliced together that didn't really belong together to get what they wanted rather than what was actually said. And so that was one of the frustrations that I had, and had not only there, but with all my dealings, is the way the media works.
And I assume what they wanted was a more sensationalistic story?
Yes. They didn't want what was happening. They wanted, it's a disaster.
And you wouldn't tell them that?
No. They got it from some of the other people that they interviewed, but that on the activist side, but there was some people that were, like I say, on the fringe.
And so did you feel that, was one frustration that you ended up looking bad with all the people that you then had to work with?
No, because a lot of them understood what was happening. But yeah, they did give us a bad time about it, joked with us, stuff like that. People at the plant, some of the activists, and even co-workers. But most of the people that had been through something like that before knew what the situation was.
So, and did you feel that across the board the media sensationalized?
There were certain individuals within the media, yes, that definitely did.
In the newspapers? Or?
Newspapers, and television. Some of the people with radio.
And generally they wanted it to be more dire than you would?
Yes. Or they would take a statement and basically misquote and blow out of proportion.
Well, that sounds frustrating.
It is. And it wasn't just with the plant. That happened with other occasions too. So it was something that Wasn't the first time, but it hopefully won't occur to me again.
Well, it seems like with environmental issues, it's always that
Yes,
to make it
it's
interesting. You have
environmental issues are very emotional,
Yeah.
and it's hard to separate yourself from it.
They're both emotional and boring.
Yeah,
I think
they
to
can
make
be.
it interesting to the public, they have to make it
Right.
very dire.
But overall, I'd say the news media does not like to have a good story. They'd rather have a disaster.
Yeah. It sells.
Right.
Okay, well, thanks. That was
Okay.